Christmas morning, and we get it for the first Sunday of Christmas. It is clearly an important reading in the life of the church. John, unlike every one of the other Gospels, does not narrate the story of Christ's birth. He doesn't talk about shepherds or kings. He doesn't talk about the harrowing journey to Bethlehem. He doesn't talk about being unable to find shelter. He doesn't talk about the innocents slaughtered because of the fear of a jealous king. John goes back to the beginning. Every Jewish listener to this story would hear the phrase, "in the beginning," and they go back to "in the beginning there was darkness. And in that beginning, God speaks, God breathes into chaos and pulls light and darkness apart. Pulls heaven and earth apart, creating a space in the world for all of creation to thrive and to grow. God plants that creation with fish and bugs and mosquitoes and bees and lizards and camels and all sorts of strange creatures. And God puts plants in creation, and God sets it up so that it grows. That is the beginning. Because for John, in Jesus' birth in the world, in the presence of God in the world, we revisit that beginning. And it's a reminder that we need. Because we know that when God comes into the world, God is not terribly welcome. And if you're not sure about that, let me just list some figures for you. John Chrysostom in the 4th century talks about poverty all the time. If you think this kind of idea of the deserving and undeserving poor is new and a part of our conversation, it is not. I can assure you that when John Chrysostom was bishop, he had some very harsh things to say about people who decided who were the deserving and the undeserving poor. He said, this is a ridiculous conversation. Nobody chooses to stand on the street corner minus a leg or an arm or an eye and perform for you so that you will give them money. Nobody wants that. And he says, you are called to give. And he says it so frequently and so harshly, he gets himself exiled and he dies on an island away from his beloved community. 1,600 years ago. Bartolome de las Casas is a Catholic saint because he traveled with the Portuguese to the New World. He was a wealthy man. He had slaves. And at one point he said, I think there might be a problem with owning slaves. And he developed some of the first Western arguments against slavery. That was 600 or 700 years ago at this point. Did I get that right? Okay, 500 years ago. And he dies in obscurity. Nobody really listens to him. Nothing really happens with that. Over and over again, the people of God step forward and they lose their lives. I'm currently reading the memoir of Polly Murray. She is amazing. She lived, studied, grew up in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And she was one of the first women educated as a lawyer. She went to Howard. She was actually a part of the very earliest arguments of the NAACP against segregation in the United States. She actually helped formulate the arguments that decades later would actually win in front of the Supreme Court. But when she was alive, every court case she was a part of. She was one of the first students to request admission to the University of North Carolina's law school, and she was rejected because she was black. Her case went to court and she lost. She stood in defense of a man who was accused of first-degree murder when it was probably clearly a case of manslaughter. That man was given the death penalty. That case was lost. Over and over and over again, she says, all of these cases were lost. But she's writing this memoir many decades later, and she says, we planted the seed of justice that could then be built upon. And the very arguments that she used to try to get in to law school in Carolina, the very arguments that they used to defend a man on death row that failed 30 years later succeeded. Martin Luther King picked up those arguments, and we all know what happened to Martin Luther King. When God comes into the world is not all that happy. The world likes the status quo. The world likes how things are. And I think that we kind of get stuck in that. It is hard for us to remember that the work of someone now comes to fruition decades, perhaps generations later. It is hard to remember that justice, that compassion, that love do prevail. They just take a long time. And so John, he brings us back to the beginning. He reminds us who we are created to be. Because in the presence of God in the world, we are called back to our original creation. When God puts human beings, the Hebrew text is actually a pun. When God puts earthlings, because they're made out of mud, when God puts those earthlings in the garden and says, be fruitful and multiply, he's not just talking about having babies. God is saying, let all of this that I have created, let it be fruitful. The whole purpose of creation is life. It is abundance. It is growth. It is working together. It is symbiosis. It is all of those things that science is realizing. We are so deeply intertwined, and there is this kind of amazing bias towards life. If you're not sure about that, just take a look at your garden if you haven't paid any attention to it. It's going to grow. Those weeds, they're going to come back. I love visiting Mount St. Helens because I remember when it blew its top. I watched it happen. And I had been there before it happened, and we went up. As soon as they let us up, my mom took us up there. And I remember it being utterly devastated, and now when I go back, there are wildflowers everywhere, and there are hummingbirds. Did you know there are hummingbirds at Mount St. Helens? I don't know how they survived, but I was hiking, and there were hummingbirds. It is stunning. Creation is meant to come back. It is meant for life, and we are just a part of that creation. And we are called to give life however we are gifted to do so. Whatever our place in life, whatever our roles, however our bodies, whatever our relationship, we are called to participate in life. And we need to be reminded that the end of the story isn't the slaughter of the innocents by Herod the king. The end of the story is not Jesus and Mary and Joseph having to flee to Egypt, seeking asylum in another land, away from their home. That's not the end of the story. The end of the story isn't even the crucifixion. That's a big part of the story that we tell. And it is embedded, if you listen to those carols that we sing, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, it is embedded in those carols. They're not just light and fluffy songs that we sing. The end of the story is resurrection. The end of the story is new life. And so John brings us back to the beginning so that we can be reminded that this is how God has worked from the beginning of time. That God creates new life. That God needs new life out of dirt and mud and causes it to flourish. And so John's Christmas story, John's narrative of the way in which God is present in the world is to remind us that the new creation that is Jesus, the new creation that is this small child, is our new creation. We are always called over and over and over again with a persistence that is tiring, but we are called always to bring new life, to receive to Virgin Mary did. We're called to bear that new life into the world around us, knowing that what we do now, that what we plant now, that what we argue for now, that what we fight for now, that what we stand for now, comes to fruition at some point. So remember,